Welcome to the food writing panel, 1,000 Synonyms for Delicious. I'm Jason Wilson, and I'm the editor of Table Matters, which is actually a food and drink publication, a website that's published here at Drexel in conjunction with the hospitality program. My esteemed colleagues on the panel today include Drew Lazor, who writes a column for the Philadelphia Daily News. What else are you doing?
A lot of just anyone dumb enough to hire me, I write for. Based freelance.
That's a lot of people.
Former columnist for the City Paper, and I think you're working on a book about German cooking.
A German cookbook that's going to be out in fall of this year.
Okay. And
Rick Nichols.
one of the elder statesmen of the food writing community, Rick Nichols.
What
are you doing these days?
But these days I teach a food writing course over at Penn in the fall. I do some freelance stuff for the Inquirer and other local magazines and such. Yeah, but my great joy is I cook the staff meal at a Mies on Fridays with Sal Vetri, Mark Vetri's dad. that's my true love.
Okay. Yeah. Very good. And Michael Klein, columnist for Philly.com, and what are you working on besides that?
Occasionally Zagat Survey. I've been working for them for a while, and trying to stay employed. But that's another story.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think what we want to talk about today is food writing, of course, in its manifold forms. I'll just toss out some questions. How is food writing? What's the state of food writing these days? Is it good? Are we in a good place? Are we in a bad place? All right, Drew.
I think it's an interesting thing to do for a living. It's weird. People always are like, I meet a lot of students and things like that who aspire to actually study to be food writers, which I always thought was interesting because I'm one of those like jerks who just like randomly became one by accident. But it's definitely different now that print is not the dominant format for discourse in this kind of industry anymore. And I think that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, and I think it makes a lot of people confused about what their role is within food coverage. But I think that the best people adapt their worldview on how to write about food to the different formats and everything like that, which is easier said than done. But it's kind of a learn-as-you-go process, at least I've found.
Maybe we should take a step back and how you mentioned something about how I run into students in my classes too who want to be food writers. I don't think any of us on the panel probably started off in writing and wanted to be a food writer. I mean, I know I started off as a novelist and wrote the worst novel of all time, and then that didn't get published. And then I took many other jobs in journalism before I found my way to food writing. I mean, I don't know, is this sort of a circuitous path either of you have?
Well, I started writing. I was the editor of my high school newspaper, and then an editor at my college paper, and then immediately went into writing for sort of major metropolitan newspapers, as they used to say, including for a long time the Philadelphia Inquirer. But most of the time I was not writing about food. I was writing about everything but food, social issues, local news, political campaigns and so forth. But I'll tell you one thing, that kind of writing, and I don't know what you folks, what your backgrounds are or whatever, but just the constant practice of writing on deadlines, writing to length, collecting information efficiently will serve you well, or served me well, when I eventually started writing about food. I have no background particularly in food. I'm not a culinary grad or what have you. Craig Laban, who's the food critic for the Inquirer, actually spent some time at a culinary school in France and has some real chops in that regard. So what I brought to the table, and what other this is it's individual, whatever, was sort of repertorial instincts. So I had to go out and cover stuff, and that's the way I approached my food column. I guess by the time I retired from the Inquirer, I'd done about maybe 1,500 columns, sort of essay type columns, not reviews particularly. But yeah, that's how I got cranking. You were a newspaper hack at one point. You still are, aren't you?
Well, I actually work for Philly.com, so technically I don't work for a newspaper anymore, but I fell into it. Mainly because I'm the child of restaurateurs. My daughter is a restaurateur. I made a conscious decision never to set foot in the back of the house of a restaurant. Or not the ownership, I would never own a restaurant. But and I was just minding my own business 20 years ago, and the guy who wrote the restaurant news column said he was going to retire. And this was just as the convention center was being built, Striped Bass was opening, and it was a pretty heady time for restaurants. And I thought, hey, what a great beat. And I just volunteered to do it. But I don't consider myself a food writer as much as, I mean, I'll let the other guys talk about the nuances of food and a lot of the sociological reasons for why we eat what we eat, but I'm more interested in the people and the business end of it, and more or less the development end of it. I really like, how some neighborhoods, grow, and of course restaurants have to grow and fit in with them too. So I'm really interested in how the business end works more than the food itself.
I think, I don't know, when I talk to people in the industry, there's always this lingering question if you're right about food, what do you know? Are you trained as, I think you just touched on it, are you trained as a chef? Are you trained in some way? What's your training? Why do you have the credibility to write about this or rate this or give your opinion? I think that there's probably that question on people's minds here, and let's talk about that a little bit. Do you feel like, maybe start with Mike, because I've heard you talk about this before, do you need to be a trained chef to be a restaurant critic?
Maybe not to be a restaurant critic. You really have to be schooled in it. I mean, it gets back to what Rick was mentioning before about being a reporter. And reporters are naturally curious. They're also great researchers. And you really have to immerse yourself in the topic. And it's, I mean, for want of a better term, it's just basic reporting. And I always wonder, but young critics tend to lather on, layer in the adjectives, and almost become silly. I think that's a technique they're using to cover their lack of knowledge about the food itself.
Well, what bugs me sometimes is these myopic blogs that will say, who's got the best cupcake. Or, I ate a hamburger today, and oh my God, it was better than the hamburger I ate yesterday. When you focus obsessively just on the thing that's on the plate in front of you, I think you lose an opportunity to talk about, basically writing about food is writing about everything. I mean, there was a story in the New York Times today about, well, let me ask you this question. Who owns Knob Creek, Maker's Mark, Jim Beam, and Lefroy? Who? Suntory, a Japanese company, has just bought all these great American iconic things. So there's a story there. This was the news, in the last couple of days. But there's a story about, bourbon culture and why whiskey is made where it's made with corn and so forth. It's not just about the taste of the liquid. It's about people's lives. It's about living in the hollers. It's about transportation. It's about taxation. It's about prohibition. All of these issues that give sort of a richness to the story. And we're dealing with those issues today. If you talk about prohibition, that's the marijuana story is basically a replay of our, dealings with prohibition, 100 years ago. I got more if you can. I'll frickin' bore your asses.
Well, do you remember Prohibition?
I remember Prohibition. It was a dry time. Actually, there was more liquor consumed during Prohibition than after it.
I always hear, when you hear people criticize sports writers who take a certain stance, and they're like, whatever, dude, you've never played in the NFL. And I'm like, that's not really the point. That's like this is the most childish argument I've ever heard. Like, that doesn't mean that you're not qualified to look at something as a reporter or as a researcher or just as a curious human and really put time and effort into understanding it and sharing your opinion or your commentary or takes on any given topic, regardless of what it is, with a readership. I don't think that, I mean, it certainly helps if you have a background in food, but it's certainly not necessary. I read a little blurb by Trey Popp, who's the critic for Philly Mag, and that's a question that people ask him a lot. Oh, what is your food background? He's worked in restaurants before, but he's not a trained chef or anything like that. But his point is, well, neither is anyone who goes to eat out at a restaurant. Most of them are not trained chefs. But that doesn't mean that they're not looking at the experience critically, which is what he views himself as, kind of an advocate for those people. So, yeah, I don't think that, I think that argument is a little short-sighted.
Well, and also, what is food writing? Is it really just about food, or is it about immigration and, you know, the harvest of shame that Edward R. Murrow wrote about? Is it about the jungle, which was labor conditions in the meatpacking industry in Chicago in the early 1900s? You know, MFK Fisher, who, if you're really interested in some of the, from the 1940s, one of the first female, like, food writers or food essayists. There's a famous quote which I'm about to butcher now, but she talked about using food as a prism or a window to talk about all the issues of the world. So, in the grain of sand, as they say, much is revealed, and which is not to say that you can't discuss the particular flavor or grind of the beef or what have you, but there's so much more out there. This week, they just released a study from the restaurant advocate group, whose name I can't remember, ROC, about the pay and tipping, $7 million in tips, not being paid, hours and wages and so forth among folks working in the restaurant industry. Well, to me, that's a food story. There's aspects of a food story in there.
I hear that a lot, this argument that food writing can be more, and MFK Fisher, what time is it? MFK Fisher usually comes up at a panel like this because, she's the essayist who takes it beyond just the plate. But there is a certain point where, like, when somebody reads food writing and they read a story about duck, right, there's a certain point where they want the recipe of duck, right? They want, there is, food writing for is, oh, here's our... there's a certain point. You want the recipe, you want the review, you want to know, was this restaurant any good or not? There is a certain, it's a genre, food writing. It's, there is a purpose to it. It's as essayistic as one wants to get. There still is, people are reading food writing. They didn't necessarily come to this to read an essay. I
absolutely
right?
agree. I'm just saying these other aspects they don't have to be the focus of the entire piece, but they can be the seasoning, the context, the accents that make the piece have more a stickierness or a weightierness or a heft that transcends the fluff of the best cupcake type story. That's all I'm really trying to say.
What he said.
I got more.
Well, maybe we should talk about. I think the best cupcake blog. I think maybe we should talk about blogs. A predominant sort of area of food writing these days is food blogging, obviously, and I think you've done it. You do it. You ran the blog at City Paper, and we have. I know Jason's here. We have Food was. Where does this fit? Like blogging fit into the whole picture?
Well, I started as a print columnist, and I was a print columnist throughout the time that I ran the blog as well for City Paper. And I think that they just sprouted out of people's everyday demand for information. like, you know, Mike's blog is extremely well read for that very reason, that every single day there's tidbits of information that people want to know about, and it's a beat that's followed very voraciously by the public, and that it just became, it came to a point where the demand could no longer be met by a print column that came out once a week, every Thursday. So it quickly became, the blog became the primary conduit through which I put out food-related writing and news and so forth, and the print column in a lot of ways almost became secondary. So I think that the popularity and ubiquitous nature of food blogs came out of the fact that it's, in Philadelphia at least, it's a really rich culture here. There's so much to talk about, and there's so many moving parts and so many people doing so many interesting things. Could this same kind of culture be sustained in a smaller city that doesn't have as many options and as many cultures kind of mashing together? I don't think so. But in Philadelphia, at least, it works out really well for the people who are interested in it, and it's a growing part of the population. I mean, I don't know if it's like a million bajillion people, but the people who are into it and read it are very, very opinionated and very vocal. So that's why you see, like, on FUBUs, you'll see, you know, these threads of comments that, you know, jut up into the 7,500, 200, because people just love to, you know, badger each other and argue and talk about stuff and share their opinions. And that's why food blogs exist, is to provide a forum for that.
Do you, in your mind, distinguish between, say, like the PC, this great profile that you won an award for this year, that, you know, that you were given, I don't know how many thousand words, you know, do you distinguish between, how do you distinguish between that and sort of just your blogging? I mean, is there two different brains? Is there two different?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the task of running the food blog is you just don't have as much time to really dig in deep for a longer feature piece, because you're always kind of hustling to get the next thing up, you know, and you're always working a couple posts ahead of your own pace. So you're kind of hustling and you're working with other people, but it makes the longer form features and the more kind of journalistic features that much more satisfying, because it's kind of a reprieve from the hustle, which can be extremely exhausting. But I mean, there's definitely more hastiness and more time pressure on the blog side, whereas on the other side, at least I hope I can dedicate more time and thoughtfulness to a longer form feature.
What about you?
What about me?
Yeah. What about talk a little bit about your column.
Well, a book.
The booze column.
Yeah, I've never really done blogging, so I've written, I used to have a weekly column at the Washington Post, their food section, about booze, and you know, I always saw that as I had to have a cocktail recipe at the end of it. So that was the sort of you know, the price of admission. And so I could write about anything I wanted to, as long as I conveyed some information about, you know, the drink, about, you know, the history, the use of the, you know, how you used it, whatever. I mean, the practical information, as long as I, you know, had a few paragraphs of that in there and it was usable, that was pretty much all anybody was really going to learn about chartreuse, was a paragraph or two. So I could just tell a story from there. I mean, and really that was, you know, a story that was, you know, obviously that had something to do with chartreuse, but I mean, it was, you know, there was something else going on. I could start over here, and as long as I made my way to the recipe, that was fine.
And I think that's the difference between really great news hounds and that where people are trying to get information, get it out quick, you know, getting inside or whatever, and stories, which are a tale, a little narrative, and they're not mutually exclusive. They just are different, you know, they're different speed limits, really. They're the two, you know, the two ways to go. I don't know whether folks here are interested in just hearing us blather about this, or did they come with certain questions about practical matters?
Can I interject? I want you to, if you don't mind, talk about your ebook, because that is taking a different platform for writing. I mean,
right.
We print, web. Why don't you talk about it?
All right, so I had been writing for Michael at Philly.com. I had been writing a wine column through last year, and a lot of these columns I took and put into a book called a series called Planet of the Grapes. I think you've seen probably the postcards floating around. I thought with wine, you know, these traditional wine books are very tough sell these days, and just I wanted to do something different. And the idea was that we would publish a small, short ebook of about 80 to 100 pages once a quarter, and we've done 3 of them so far. And I mean, this is we essentially created a press at Drexel, a digital-only press at Drexel, and we've been publishing them through there and promoting them through the website, Table Matters, and just publish it on our own, basically, as an experiment. And you know, we wanted to see. We've been experimenting with different price points. I mean, we've put them out. They started out at $4.99. They've been 99 cents. They've been $2.99. I mean, it's, you know, with ebook publishing, it's the Wild West, and you know, it's been, I'd say it's a mixed bag so far as an experiment. But I mean, we're going to see how it goes. I don't know. Well, I mean, I think it's right now in all of this is a publishing issue, not just a food writing issue. I think in all of publishing, no one knows where it's going. I mean, you can't, like, Michael, when I saw him today, said, "Oh, you know, I still have a job." You know, I mean, I think, you know, when we're talking about the newspapers, you know, it's a sort of, it's chaos over there right now. It's very dysfunctional in journalism right now, and nobody knows where the future's going.
Well, the other thing is it's monetizing your work, and it gets down to, I mean, this sounds, you know, we write because we love it, but we have bills to pay, and you know, in the olden days, guys like Rick and I think you're a little too young for this, but they used to hire people at living wages at newspapers and publications.
I remember living.
Remember living?
That was great.
Yeah, it was great. And now, you know, it's not that way, and the scale for freelancers is, you know, that's a dirty topic, but I think we should bring this up, or.
I think so. Because I think it raises an interesting point about, you know, the state of journalism, really, because I know in the realm of drinks, of wine and spirits that I cover, a lot of times the outlets pay so little that you have a lot of people that are writers or journalists that aren't really, they really make their money because they're a brand ambassador for Pernod Ricard or something, and then they do their journalism on the side. And so there's a lot of, you know, conflict of interest, and that's created because you know, you don't make a livable wage sometimes as a food writer. You know, if you're starting out, you get $50 a blog post or something. Well, you know, a company, you know, a big winery, a big, you know, a big food company, you know, a restaurant, whatever. You know, there's a very, you know, gray area between PR and journalism these days, and I think it's been.
Like, excuse me, there are guys like, I mean, Drew, and maybe this is a good time for Drew to tell us how he does it, because...
very disorganizedly, and just it's kind of a hustle, but if I don't have work or I'm being underpaid for hard work, I don't have anyone but myself to blame. Getting mad at kind of like the steel industry is kind of like yelling at the sun, like, you're too hot, you know what I mean? Like, that's just not, there's no point. Like a publication recently offered me an opportunity to write a nationally focused trend piece that was nationally sourced, so they wanted me to interview people in different cities. They wanted it to be like 800 to 1,200 words. You know, a national story that could run, it could potentially have run in a magazine or newspaper, and they wanted to pay me like $60.
Oh, God.
And I was, but like, I feel as though, I think there are people that would say yes to that, but I'm just not in the position to say yes to that. Yesterday, someone asked me if I wanted to write a feature about Jose Garza's new restaurant. We're not in a position to offer writers pay right now, but it's great exposure. That's what they always say. It's like, I don't need exposure. I need to freaking pay my mortgage and cell phone bill, bro. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like, but you can get frustrated by that kind of stuff, but I feel as though if you're not doing it, as a freelancer, there's no one to blame but yourself.
Yeah. I mean, we should clarify, it wasn't always this way. Like, when I was the food critic for Philly Magazine back in 2002, 2003, my monthly eating budget was $1,500 a month. Yeah. That wasn't even including my fee that I would get, my monthly salary. So, I mean, there was a time in the not too distant past, I mean, I can remember a magazine calling me up and saying, hey, do you want to go to Sardinia? And yeah, sure. And it was like, and then we'll pay you $7,000 on top of a free trip to Sardinia. Yeah, that sounds great, But that is like, that may as well have been during Prohibition. I mean, it's so far beyond. It was only probably 2005, but it's changed that much in less than a decade.
Well, when you think about the economics of the old print industry, the Inquirer, about 5 or 6 years ago, was bought by a local group of investors for $500 million. The last time around, what, 2 years ago, a year or two ago?
2 years ago.
2 years ago, it went for $50 million, and it's going down. I mean, 500, 50. And it's always based on revenues, so you can see what's happened to that kind of budget.
And they're going to auction it off according to this one.
Well, there's a dispute over what kind of auction and where, and yeah, but yeah.
What do you do when for someone who's qualified, like Drew, to write a piece that is going to be substantial investment in time and research, and they don't want to pay for it, so then they go to the next one, and the next one, so finally someone says, okay, I'll do it. So how do you buy quality? You don't. So everything becomes diluted, and you get to the point where whoever's writing the article, as Jason points out, either is being subsidized by someone for a point of view, or they're just shouldn't be doing it.
I have to disagree with you, because it's not a question of they aren't qualified or they're not skilled. They may be young, new, desperate, in need of exposure that maybe Drew's not in need of that kind of exposure, but there are plenty of people who really legitimately are in need of that kind of exposure and will sell themselves cheaply because that's the trade-off for them. And I don't know that that makes them unqualified. I think it just makes them at a different place professionally.
There's always someone young who needs exposure.
Sure. I don't know that means
It's the way of the world.
And the thing is, there's not only always someone, there's always plenty of someone. So I don't know that it's true. I mean, it's great that you're in a position to turn that down, but there are plenty of people who aren't in a position to turn that down. And
Go for it.
The fact that someone's not in a position to turn it down doesn't mean that they're not talented, skilled, effective, competent.
Most help wanted that to say experience preferred.
Absolutely, but you're talking about a completely different climate where there are hundreds and hundreds of food bloggers. Some of them really suck, and some of them are really great, and most of them aren't getting paid.
Yeah.
And what happens if you turn down so many that the phone stops ringing?
Then I will be out on the street. So yeah, I mean there's an economics to it, just like any other freelance gig. People who do freelance anything. But on the flip side of what you were talking about, like the exposure and everything like that, the more you take on that you feel like you're underpaid for, or you feel like the pay does not match the amount of work and effort you're putting into it, then you're diluting your own product and you're diluting yourself, which is a really, really slippery slope. Like I have a photographer friend who mentions that there's other photographers out there who try to undercut him on rates and stuff like that. And he's like, okay, if you want to do that, that's fine. Like you can do it for $50 less than I can do it. But like it is extremely dangerous because it becomes this like reverse auction, like bidding war, and then no one's making any money. So it's you really can just have to kind of like think of yourself. Trust me, I'm not in any position to be turning down like everything.
You have a line or a threshold.
Yes. So if it's more than $0, I will do it. Is basically my thing.
Don't tell me that.
So then in that same vein, as you're getting into a position, or as you're in a position where you can kind of be a bit choosy, or do you feel like you're more so selling your work, like you're are you selling your own words and your own tone and how you choose to represent things, or are you more open to catering to, you know, this company asked me to do this, so I'm going to tailor it to fit that?
That's a good question. I think that it's definitely a gray area between the two. Sometimes people who approach me about writing stuff will say very specific parameters for what they want. And other people will say, you know, we liked your column on XYZ. We're hoping you can do something similar in tone on this topic. But I think that, I mean, I've been doing it long enough that I think some people are familiar with the style of writing that I choose to take and stuff like that, which I think is awesome. But I'm never really in a position to say, you know, this doesn't like jive with my personal brand. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not like, ugh. But people like, and I also do like a lot of like copywriting projects that are like not bylined. You know, like just content curation and creation and stuff like that. So I mean, it's a big mix of different gigs. But I mean, if it was up to me, I would like to do, you know, kind of more personal touch columns across the board. But that's just not the reality of the industry currently for me, at least.
And I think the bigger the magazine, the more likely they're going to beat the personal voice out of.
Yeah,
it
happens.
I just had a couple questions. I write a weekly short column for the Courier Post in South Jersey, and one of the things that I struggle with every week is, do I put a recipe in that column? And the paper's never said anything to me one way or the other, and I'd really rather not put a recipe in there. So I'm just interested as to where that kind of came from. And my second question would be, how do you cull topics for a weekly column?
Yeah, I mean, eventually it catches up to you. I think, you know, like after 5 years, 6 years, it starts to get very hard to kind of have to come up with topics. But I know the recipe, I think at the Post, there was such a rigorous recipe testing, and so the people that read the section knew that all the recipes had been tested and, you know, and so there was this sense that people went to this for the recipe, and we had a recipe archive that they could search in, and, you know, it was, you know, so it was like a major part of the section, so there was no question there had to be a recipe, you know, and if there wasn't a recipe, there would be a recommendation box with tasting notes or something like that. I mean, I just think, I don't know, I mean, I guess I think it's important because I think that not everybody's going to read it for your like sterling literary prose, right? Some people just want, you know, to learn how to do something, right? I mean, that's what they're reading the food section for, and so, you know, I think you can do both. You know, you can have a little box that does all the practical stuff, and then you can have your sort of literary side. You know, you can have your personal essay. You know, you can do both things.
Because I actually do the little box. That's what I do. I'm the little box.
The little box is great because it's like all the practical stuff is here and all of my lovely prose is over here, right? I mean, it's very simple. I don't know, how do you guys feel about that?
I think one advantage that you might have had is that cocktail recipes, for instance, tend to be relatively abbreviated.
Yeah.
You know, they're not, well, that's what I'm saying. You're not taking up all your precious space with that. I don't understand why in a lot of the, well, I guess it's being done now, but in a lot of the print formats, people don't just write the stories and then have a little bug at the end, you know, for an online, go to an online recipe, or because recipes for complicated dishes, you know, go on, and some people want to see that, but you know, space, real estate in print is pretty scarce, but online it's infinite, you know. I guess that's not profound, is it?
It's
pretty profound.
Pretty deep.
Pretty prosaic.
I mean, I'm going to write it and tack it on my board.
Yeah, right. Infinity.
Your Pinterest.
Yeah.
No, I was thinking, I think that the days of the newspaper printed recipes waning, just like a few years ago we eliminated pretty much all of the TV listings. It's not a very efficient use of space.
What are the stock listings? Are they
stock listings? Wow, remember those?
Yeah, but they're gone too, right?
Almost. There's some, I think we run local stocks.
We got rid of the one ads too, didn't we?
Yeah, we did. There's something called Craigslist.
Craigslist.
Pardon?
And the op-ed page on Saturday.
Yeah, okay. Don't remind us.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Okay,
maybe I'm hungover, but I'm getting depressed by this conversation.
Oh, wait,
You came to the wrong channel, man.
Yeah.
don't get us
Can
started.
I redirect it back to the blogging and specifically to crowdsourced reviews? We all know that Craig LeBanc can make or break a place, or at least make it, and that ever since the days of Craig Claiborne, the reviewer had a lot of power contributing to the success of a business. So how about crowdsourced review? What impact is that having on the industry?
Well, I have one beef, and then I'll shut up about it. But one is the Yelp situation where it seems to be crowdsourced, but it's actually manipulated with algorithmic stuff often, where if you don't play ball and subscribe to the Yelp folks material as a restaurant or what have you, that the bad reviews tend to float to the top of the listings, and the good ones tend to float to the bottom. And to me, that's not crowdsourcing so much as sort of a quiet corruption of things. But that's my little speech.
The other thing I was going to add to that is, do critics matter? I mean, we talk about them like, LeBanc gives 0 bells to Ocean Prime, and everybody goes, ooh, ooh, ooh. But I checked in, their business wasn't affected.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I did a piece about Friday, Saturday, Sunday a few weeks ago, which has been there for 40 years over by Rittenhouse Square, and it's one of those places where everybody says, I used to go there 15 years ago. I loved that place, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
But after the article came out, which got fairly big display, their business has been kind of, just because it reminded people,
Sure.
And their phone has been ringing off the hook. So it wasn't a review particularly, but it was whatever.
So I guess you could say that the media matters. I mean, I won't say the press anymore. It's an antiquated
Yeah, and we
word.
can't use the word exposure because he's all freaked out about
But
it.
I think, the day of the critic is waiting. There's no question. Even this kind of nonsense about being anonymous when you really aren't. I don't know if anybody saw this, but the restaurant critic Adam Platt for New York Magazine came out of the closet and they put his picture on the cover of the magazine and says, I'm not going to be anonymous anymore, because he never really was anonymous to begin with. If there's a restaurateur that doesn't know what Craig LeBanc looks like at this point, then God help you. Seriously.
Pictures pasted in the back of every restaurant.
And so this sort of anonymity is ridiculous. When I've at various times been a critic, I've tried to remain anonymous. I didn't go out of my way and wear mustaches and beards and things, but I tried to at least make a reservation under a false name or whatever. But I didn't have fake credit cards. At a certain point, they would know who it was or whatever. But if I'm reviewing a restaurant, I've probably eaten the entire menu at the restaurant 3 times in the span of 10 days. If you're a restaurateur and there's a guy that comes in and drops $700 3 times, in 9 days, and you don't treat me well, God, you've got other problems. This is what whether they had. I can remember one restaurant where it was they literally. I was a 32-year-old guy, and I had come into La Croix and spent $1,000 3 different nights within a 7-day period. Was anybody gonna, maybe, I don't know. They could have easily, who was I?
They'd ask you to sell them drugs.
At the very least, I was a good customer, right? And so that's what I don't understand about all of this, this craziness and all this hand-wringing over the anonymity of the critic. Maybe you feel differently, but I think I've come full circle on that. I agree with the guy in New York, I think.
But Jason, you touched on a really good point there. You went to that restaurant, you spent a lot of money, you ate there many times, and you wrote about it. Right?
Right.
And the crowdsource review, if it has a similar impact or no impact, is usually someone that ate there once. Anybody want to talk about that dichotomy?
I think regardless of the ethics of things like Yelp or the auspices of how it's done, or whether or not people are qualified or not qualified to share opinions, at the end of the day, chefs and restaurant owners care about Yelp. Do you care about Yelp, Justin?
It's a tab open every day on the computer.
Yeah, every single day you have to look at it because it matters. I mean, like, what you can kind of complain about whether or not it's fair or whether or not it's ethical or what have you. But when you type in the name of a restaurant, Philly, and Google, Yelp's one of the top 3 results every single time. It does matter. I mean, to sit there.
I didn't say it doesn't matter. I do think it matters, and that's why I think the ethics of it and so forth are important. But go ahead.
No, but yeah, but I just think that it's something that it's just another thing that restaurant people have to pay attention to. Are there ridiculous Yelp reviewers out there who lambaste places and criticize ridiculous things and get mad for no reason? Yeah, absolutely. But I think that folks who read them, at least if I go to a new city and I'm looking at like a Yelp thing, I can look down and be like, that dude's crazy, not gonna believe him. And like there's a place called in Chicago called Graham Elliott, the chef Graham Elliott. He has a place called I think it's called Gramwich. It's like his sandwich shop. And there was a big Yelp hubbub a couple years ago because it wasn't open yet, and some guy walked by and wanted to go to lunch there, and it wasn't open, so he went back and made a one-star review. And it's like, 1 star, I wanted to go to lunch here today. It wasn't open yet. Like, the restaurant hadn't like debuted yet. Like, you know what I mean? It wasn't like hours or anything. It was still being built. And he was like, 1 bell. Like,
you're lucky to get 1 bell.
That's actually a Yelp problem. Then Yelp should vet those.
Right. It was taken down eventually, but it was just that was just used as a sterling example of like Yelp gone bad or whatever. So.
Yeah, Yelp isn't the only one that does that though. I mean, Food and Wine, like, over a decade has done that more than once. Like the hot restaurant openings, and they'll have like, check out this hot new restaurant, and it hasn't even opened because they're working 3 months in advance. They've called up a local food critic and said, what are the new restaurant openings going to be? And they tell them, oh, there's a new Steven Starr place. And I can remember at least 2 or 3 times where the restaurant hasn't even opened yet. Locally, it's not open, you can't eat there, and they're already sort of like Food and Wine's working in advance. You've seen this before.
There's a question way back there. Yep.
Hi, I just, as far as Yelp is concerned, I use Yelp a lot when I'm traveling as well and I don't know a city, but I find that I have to really go layers deep to find out if people are legitimate. And so I usually look at people's names and see where they've been and kind of see what they said about places that I know. And I can never take the face value of what someone says as being someone that's credible. But if I check out the other places they've been and how they've rated it, then I can kind of find out what I need. So it winds up not being as simple as just opening the app and seeing what people say, because you really don't know the credibility of the person who's posting it.
Yeah, reasonable people use it reasonably, I would say, Yeah.
Sounds like a whiskey industry story.
Well, I think I read a piece recently too how some people game it. They'll put sort of nasty things on Yelp, and then of course most restaurants have like a social media person or consultant or whatever, and then they'll go to the person, the Yelp complainer, and offer them a free meal or say, we really want to make you happy, we want to make this right. Well, once the word gets around about that, it sort of also stokes a sort of a false, whatever.
But at the same time, though, with the way that things work with you guys now and with Yelp, it's almost like there's this real-time competition. Like from the restaurant side, sometimes it's like, all right, my company recently went through something like, okay, we know that when we're ready to open, we don't even have to set a date because enough people will blog about it and we can rely on that, that'll get word out. And then with Yelp, there's a competition. Oh, something opened, I have to be the first person to go there. I have to be the first person to have an opinion about it.
Well, it's funny that you talk about, we talk about the maybe the waning role of some restaurant critics. I happen to think Craig Laban still has quite a role in Philadelphia. Some people might think it's too big, some people may not. I think he's very meticulous and very credible and, agree with a lot of what he says, not 100%. But when you talk about, now I'm losing my train of thought. Tell me, what was your last thing? What? The critic. Oh, they said that with Yelp and bloggers and so forth, restaurants used to start slow with soft openings, and then maybe a critic would come in a month, 6 weeks later after they kind of got the bugs out. Now, bloggers are there day one, taking pictures of the food, criticizing the service, and so you've got a reverse situation going on in a lot of restaurants where before they might have started out slow and trained themselves up and kind of hit their stride in a few weeks. Now they put a tremendous amount of effort into their opening weeks and try to get their buzz and so forth. And if you go 2, 3, 4 months later, they might have slacked off. It's the opposite thing. You see a lot of restaurants putting in their first team, the varsity. They put in, especially places like a Star or whatever that have a big bench, they put all their big guys in for the first burst. They get their review, and then those guys are out. And
you see a lot of the dishes that maybe they're getting some critical acclaim for, but those sort of disappear after 6 months sometimes. I can't remember exactly, but there's been cases where, it's a dish that all the critics are writing about because it's so wildly inventive, and then you go a year later and it's not on the menu. And you wonder what happens.
But I think that knocking the door down mentality where people are ready to eat there and ready to talk about it and blog about it or Yelp about it before it is even open kind of goes back to what we were discussing a little bit earlier with that appetite of the audience to just always be consuming as much information as possible and as wanting to be part of the scene and part of the culture, which I think is ultimately a really cool thing. It's a really good thing.
Yeah, I have a bunch of people who just badger me when they know a place is getting pretty close. It's like, well, what day are they opening? What day are they opening? Are they doing a soft opening? Are they doing family? Are they doing, staff training? They're obsessed with it. And, I did a story about it, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. It was pretty much before the blog, about the first nighters, these people that had to be first.
Yeah.
And it's an obsession with some people. I don't understand it. I really don't understand it.
All right, I think we have time for one more question here.
So Rick, you kind of touched on this earlier, and I feel like we got very caught up in the restaurant review aspect of food writing. But I feel like there's so much more to food writing. As a matter of fact, I would say that restaurant reviews is probably less than half of the food writing that goes on. So can you just touch a little bit on more of the cultural, social, sociological aspects of food writing? How our food reflects what's going on in the country, in the world, and how we eat.
Best food stories are human stories. Just like any other beat, I think it's completely true. The best sports stories are human stories, I think what you said is completely true. For my column in the Daily News, I find myself tending a lot toward immigrant populations and people who came to America to do something different and do something new. I've written about young Indian guys who started a Kati roll place, and I wrote about these two Caribbean guys who started their own place in Upper Darby a couple of weeks ago. Those are the kinds of stories that I personally tend to cover because I think that, like you said, food is an excellent prism through which to look at someone's culture and someone's kind of chasing of the American dream, so to speak. It's really fun.
I agree, though, that there is the focus is often too much on the critic, the restaurant review, and I think a lot of the PR people, the focus is too much on that. Whereas your restaurant could get just as much publicity if you were to work with the writer on
feature,
poking with them on a feature or something like that. It might even be more interesting, more better.
I think it's more interesting.
Probably more engaging.
Yeah.
More accessible.
Everybody wants to hear what the story is. And I think that that's something that you lose in terms of when you read a review, a critical review of a restaurant. You're not getting the story. You're not getting why they're doing what they're doing, what's important to them.
Well, you don't have to go back too many years. Philadelphia had a very, very, very small Mexican population. Latinos would tend to be Dominican or Puerto Rican, or what have you, and then for a variety of reasons, including economic stuff in New York, you started getting a trickle of Mexican workers in Philadelphia. And that was a great opportunity to start writing about. If you wrote about a taqueria, you would say, well, this is a taqueria, and the tortilla might be this and that. But it's emblematic of a major shift in the population in the city, and it just opens all kinds of doors that give a richness to the culinary thing. And there were some fun, and continue, and it just happens time after time. Jonathan Gold has made a career out of it in L.A., where he's sometimes the head of the U.S. Census Department and figuring out, which part of what region of Chinese folks are, coming to into Monterey Park or what have you. But
well, I think they're giving us the hook right here.
yeah, we're out. I'm good. That's all I got.
We'll hit it. Let's call this a pause, and we can continue this conversation through the afternoon as we see each other. So thanks for coming. Thanks.